So let me turn then to the topic for this evening. It's an enormous topic, and so we're really going to be focusing on it from the beginning through the end. It's nothing less than the political economy of Covid, of this extraordinary, historic public health disaster that has been wreaking havoc, as we know, for 2 years. We are now going into our 3rd year of the pandemic and all the damage it has done, and yet also in the context of a system that is already in deep trouble. And indeed, if I had to tell you at the beginning what the overarching theme is that we will return to at the conclusion of our talk today, it's that we're talking about a system in extreme difficulty and a system, an economic system, capitalism, to be clear, that's in a period of decline, at least in the West, that we're going to have to understand as the best context to understand what is going on. So it is appropriate for me to begin this evening by taking note of a remarkable article that appeared in the major newspaper in Canada, the Toronto Globe and Mail, an internationally respected newspaper that is, in a sense, the voice of Canada for many people in the country and around the world. They carried an article by Thomas Homer Dixon. He's the director of something called the Cascade Institute, a major prestigious think tank located in British Columbia. But the Toronto Globe and Mail gave him the space and the position to write this remarkable article in the first week of January 2022. Here's his point in that article. The United States, the southern neighbor of Canada, an immense border of thousands of miles in length, is in turmoil, writes Professor Homer Dixon. There is major social division. There is major trouble. There is a possibility of a civil war because the divisions seem to be unbridgeable. Canada, he urges his readers, isn't prepared for this, hasn't understood how serious and dangerous the threat of a disintegrating United States capitalism would be for its northern neighbor. I want to stress this article's appearance because it gives you a glimpse as to how a growing part of the world, not just in Canada by a long shot, is viewing the decline of a system here in the United States. And much of what I'm about to tell you is the evidence accumulating that is making people like Professor Homer Dixon reach these conclusions, and it's also explaining why the authorities running major media in many countries feel the need to provide space for this perspective to get aired. You'll see it sooner outside the United States than inside, and that too is a kind of evidence for decline. So let me turn to the bits and the pieces that together make up a political economy of Covid in year number 3. One of the most important indices of whatever is going on in a society is population. Is your population growing? Is it shrinking? Is it staying the same? Something very notable has happened in recent years, the last 20, here in the United States, where I'm speaking. Population growth has stopped. Population flat is what we have, barely any change the last couple years, and the trajectory is towards population loss. That's always a sign of very big changes happening when you get that, especially when you get that kind of change in your population dynamics in a short number of years. and becomes even more serious when we look at what the reasons are, when we break down the overall numbers of population. So why is it going down in the United States? Well, some things are obvious. Our population is aging, so a larger percentage of people than would have been the case before are dying a natural death. But that's not a major cause because it's not a major number. Well then, here are some of the others. COVID itself. We're coming up on 1 million dead Americans. A stunning reality that is hurting our population growth, to be as polite about it as I can. Then there's the opioid crisis. A huge number of people, particularly in childbearing ages, that are dying from overdoses. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them across the country. Number 3, we don't allow people into the country, starting particularly with Obama, escalating with Trump, and continuing with Biden, is a rejection of immigration, which is another way your population grows. I'll come back later and talk about the irony that we've been busy pushing people out of the United States, blocking them from coming in, and yet the last 5 months have been full of what? Headlines about labor shortage. Hello, you wouldn't have had the shortage if you didn't do what you did with immigrants, whom you scapegoated for all kinds of things they had little to do with. But as I said, we'll come back. But here's the interesting thing. None of those reasons are the major cause of the decline of population. The major one is even more important to understand. We have had a dramatic decline in the birth rate here in the United States. Women and men are choosing not to have children on a scale that is what the big number is in terms of crushing our population, and meaning that in the last couple of years, we've had virtually no population growth at all. That doesn't make the United States stronger. It doesn't make the United States a place that is encouraging people to come, to settle, and to build families. It's doing exactly the opposite. And that's a sign of a society in trouble, because there are fairly obvious linkages between one of the major reasons young people give for why they don't have more children or any children at all is that they can't afford it, that the income of young men and young women is barely enough to manage their lives, and the idea of another mouth to feed and body to clothe and shelter to provide is simply so frightening, given already accumulated indebtedness and all the rest that we know so well, that it is having the kind of effect on something as fundamental as family planning and population. And I wanted to make sure you understood that's a context for the COVID analysis we're going to turn to. And the last preliminary has to do with a speech made very early, first week of January of 2022, by President Biden. And he did there what presidents typically do in the United States. He took very troubling news about the economy, found something in there that sounds positive, hyped it beyond all recognition, and then proceeded to say little or nothing about all the problems that the economy is showing in the first week of 2022. It doesn't make Biden exceptional, but that's the problem. He follows a pattern that ought to be something we're ashamed of as a society. It confuses what our leaders tell us about the reality we face with what the job of an advertiser is, to hype whatever's good about the product he or she is selling and to hide whatever isn't. So let me explain. We've had a very rough 2 years. Everyone knows that. Here in the United States and in many other countries as well. We have been suffering nothing less than the combined impact of both a major capitalist economic crash, because that's what we've had these last 2 years, occurring together in the same time on this planet with one of the worst public health disasters in the history of our species. We've had one or the other before. We've never had them both together at the same time in this manner, and we are reeling. Over the time in the United States of the first year, 2020, we lost in this country just under 10 million jobs. Those were the jobs that were lost. Net, after accounting for somebody who leaves one job and goes to other. A net loss of almost 10 million jobs. The following year, 2021, the year about which Mr. Biden spoke, we gained employment. We put people back to work. But here's the crucial reality. How many did we put back to work? 6.5 million, rough number. Which means that as of January 2022, we have, get ready, 3.5 million fewer jobs than we had in February of 2020. 2 years later, we're still down 3.5 million jobs. Now, whatever else you might call that, a roaring economic recovery, it isn't. Could it have been even worse? For sure. But that's the only comfort anyone has any entitlement to take. This is an economic disaster that we're living through. And our job situation, granted our population didn't grow a lot, but it grew, which means while the number of people sustained by this economy grew, the number of jobs to produce goods and services dropped by 3.5 million that are not there today, jobs that were there in February 2 years ago. Not a roaring economy, not something to boast about. And where do you hide it? You hide it by referring to the fact, well, wages have been going up too. Well, I do have to play my role of economist here with all of you for, again, a moment of honesty in the face of this pretty ugly playing with numbers. The current inflation rate in the United States, that is the rate at which consumer goods prices are rising, what we pay for in the supermarket or the department store, if they're open and if they have stuff on their shelves, we have to say that these days, the consumer price index of the last year has risen 7%. Probably will be showing higher numbers in the next 2 or 3 months. So if your wages have gone up, let's say 5%, and that's the average in this country, if your wages have gone up 5%, you're still falling behind. Your extra 5% compared to what you got last year is not enough to pay for the goods and services that have gone up 8%, 7 or 8%. In other words, what you can afford to buy is lower now. And that's what your wages are for, to enable you to buy things. You can't buy them if your wages have gone up. And they haven't gone up even to keep pace with inflation. So the honest argument is we have millions of fewer jobs and we have a lower real wage in terms of what it can afford you for the vast majority of Americans. And here's a last example of how bad it is. In the last week of December, President Biden signed the National Defense Authorization Act. This is an annual procedure in which the president gives a lot of money to the military. And true to form, this year, our president, this year just passed, gave $768 billion to the military, kind of more than you can wrap your head around. But I want to talk to you about how it was done so that you understand how prices and wages are manipulated in this country in the interests of some and against the interests of others. There's nothing neutral, there's nothing democratic about it. The money given to the military this year is 5% more than it was last year. So they've got a big, nice 5% raise. But let's look at it. There are two ways that money is given to the military. One is to pay more money to the Marines and sailors and Army personnel and Air Force personnel in their wages. That went up in the new bill. Get ready. By 2.7%. That's the increase all of our men and women in uniform were given. Well, if the average of the total bill for military went up 5%, but you only gave 2.7% to the wages, well, that leaves the other one, the other part of military spending could go up a lot to get you to the average of 5%. And what is the other part? It's the part we give to, ready? Big corporations, the ones who make the bullets, the guns, the planes, the missiles, the tanks, and all the rest of that. Their money went up 7 or 8 or 9%, while the worker, the people in our military got only 2.7% for the average between them of 5%. Even the government, at a time of verbally celebrating men and women in uniform, actually screwed those people by giving them 2.7% at a time when the prices they have to pay, like you and I, have gone up, consumer price index, by 7% at least. We are watching an economic system that is behaving self-destructively. Why? Why do I say that? Because the answer is a population that has gone through the levels of unemployment and economic dislocation I've just summarized over the last 2 years. A population terrorized by COVID-19, losing now nearly 1 million people to death, and we don't even know what the economic and physical health and mental health problems coming down the road from this disease are likely to be. A population that has gone through 2 years like the ones we just went through is now rewarded by being slapped in the face with an inflation, with a situation where the wages on average have gone up 4 to 5% and the prices have gone up 7%, in which they're falling behind. What a remarkable way to enter the third year of an ongoing economic and public health disaster. This is something a society would never do if it wasn't desperate, if it wasn't in real trouble. You are now squeezing the very people whose upset, whose anger is fueling the kinds of extremes that Professor Homer Dixon in Canada was pointing us to in that article I spoke to you about when we began. Let me turn then to the political economy of COVID-19 entering year number 3. I want to begin by making crystal clear, so no one has any illusion, what the reality is in terms of particularly the United States, but what I'm about to say applies to most of Western Europe as well, in relationship to many other parts of the world, in terms of what the COVID-19 situation has meant. I'm going to compare the United States and China for all the reasons that those are two good examples. Partly because their experience is so different, partly because they confront the same problem, but have handled it in such a different way. So let's begin with 3 simple statistics. COVID cases, people who have been diagnosed and written down by a government agency or a private agency as having contracted the disease. And these are numbers that I took as of January 8th, 2022, as provided by the World Health Organization, as reliable and as neutral an agency as exists for statistics like this. In the United States, 57.5 million people have gotten this disease. Right? 57.5 million Americans, 20%, 1 in 5, have gotten this disease. In the People's Republic of China, a country with 4 times the number of people that we have in America, in the United States, the total number of cases of COVID is 133,000. Yes, you heard that right. In the United States, 57.5 million. In the People's Republic of China, much larger country, 133,000. Let's turn next to deaths, people who've died from the COVID disease as kept by the medical personnel that attended them when they died. In the United States, again, as of January 8th, 826,000 deaths. In the People's Republic of China, a country 4 times larger, a total of 5,700 deaths. 826,000 versus 5.7 thousand. There is no comparison here. None. Fully vaccinated in the United States, 60%. In China, 83%. I'll stop. The point is made. But I can't leave it without a memory. When I was a child growing up here in the United States, I remember our teacher, I believe it was around the time of the Korean War, telling us how we should understand that folks in Asia seem to have less respect for human life than people here in the United States. I didn't think much about it. It didn't make much of an impression. I probably didn't understand exactly what was being said. But I do know what evidence this set of numbers gives us. One part of the world has allowed 826 people to die, 826,000 people to die. And that other part of the world, much larger, has allowed only 133,000. If you want to draw conclusions about respect for life, it runs exactly the other way from what my teacher told me all those years ago. What is going on? And my argument for you is that we have an economic system, our capitalism, particularly here in the West, which was uniquely unable to prepare for or to cope with this disease. And it's very important to see that connection between the economic system and the horrific failure to cope with, to manage this disease the way other countries. And China is by far not the only one. I could have picked New Zealand. I could have picked all manner of other countries of varying economic systems. But choosing the 2 global world powers is an important thing to focus on as well. So what do I mean we didn't prepare for? Simple. We all know what a virus needs because we've had viruses in the past and in the near past as well. We know. We know we need tests. We know we need masks. We know we need ventilators. We know we need hospital beds and ICU units and medical personnel. We know it all. We know we're going to be affected by viruses sooner or later, and we know what we need to handle them, or at least part of what we need. And we have the companies here in the United States, the private enterprises, because that's what we pride ourselves on, right? That we have a private enterprise kind of capitalism here. We have the enterprises that could have made all of those things, could have produced them, could have stored them around the country in the right places, in the right quantities, so that we would be prepared. But they didn't do it. And there's no way around this. Not only did they not do it in advance, they still haven't done it. If I had more time, I would tell you about my wife and I wandering around the city of New York for hours 3 days ago, looking to buy home testing kits for COVID. And drugstore after drugstore, we don't have them anymore. We're very sorry. And finally, we found one and we got one. We paid $34. And when I looked it up in October, it had been selling for $15. What's going on? It's a system that isn't working. Those companies made the decision that it was more profitable for them to do something else, not to make the tests, the gloves, the ICU unit, none of it. The private sector was busy making profits somewhere else. Because, it is risky. You build these, make these masks, and then you store them in a building where the air has to be controlled and the temperature has to be controlled, and you have to make sure they're not wearing out and that you have to replace them or they'll get dirty, blah, blah. All of that is money, and they didn't say, well, we don't know when the next virus is going to hit. So it turns out that to prepare a population for a disease isn't profitable for private capitalists to do. Okay, there you have it, friends. Look what I've just said. We know what we need for public health, and the capitalist private enterprises won't do it. And it's not a thought or a hypothesis. It's what we're living through, that failure. Nor did the government come in, which it could have, and said to them, you produce the masks, we'll take it. Once you produce them, we'll store them, we'll monitor them, we'll clean them, we'll take care of them to have the population ready. The government could have done that. We know that because that's what the government does with defense equipment. Doesn't pay anyone to build a tank either, and then store it and clean it and monitor it, waiting for whenever the next war might come or not, 2 or 4 or 6 years from now, when that tank will be finally bought from us. No, we don't wait in this country. The government comes in, buys the tank as fast as you produce it, then at public expense, yours and mine, it is stored, cleaned, monitored, and all the rest. We could have done that to be prepared for the pandemic, but we didn't. So the private sector doesn't do it because it's not profitable. But we need it, but it's not profitable. And in the struggle between what we need to be prepared and what private profit will do, invest elsewhere, we lose. Capitalism is our problem. The profit system, the notion that you do it if it's profitable and you don't if it isn't, is a fundamental mistake that we have to recognize, and it's a system we have to change. Nor have they coped. They weren't prepared. Now they can't cope. That's why I had to pay $34 for a test kit. We're in a society that doesn't know how to manage it. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to hammer at one point right here. One of the ways that many countries, not just People's Republic of China, have handled this is by what they call a lockdown. They do a massive concentrated effort wherever there's an outbreak, in this city, in that rural province, wherever. They close it, they isolate it. They bring in massive amounts of public and private resources, mobilized and coordinated by the government to maximally impact the constriction of that disease. Test everybody. Track everybody, who they've talked to, who they've been with. Treat every case that you find. Don't allow movement of people in and out. Lock it down for weeks in some cases. But that's why they have the better statistics. We're going to come back to those lockdowns because I'm going to show you that lockdown was also the strategy in the United States. We just didn't call it that, but that's what it was, and its impacts are why we are in the terrible place we find ourselves in now. Okay, why is there a failure to mobilize public and private resources? And here, the critique of capitalism becomes global, as befits our topic today. What do I mean? Well, COVID is a problem for the globe. In a way, it's like the Black Plague was a problem, at least for all of Europe, back in the 13th and 14th century, when it dealt a death blow to European feudalism. It's like a terrible scourge that has happened repeatedly. The Spanish flu 100 years ago, Ebola, MERS, SARS. We know. What do we know? We know that we now live in a world economy, more so than at any time in human history. It's been the capitalists who, to make money, profits again, moved production all over the world, produce here, store it over there, process it over there, and get us, they say, more profitable ways of producing goods. That's why most of the things in your house, if you look at them, say made in, and it's not USA. It's China or India or Brazil or someplace else. Those are those long supply chains we hear about. Well, the world is now linked by all of these things. And what that means is that a disease is global. The remarkable thing about COVID-19 is that every corner of the world is threatened, is affected, is shaped, and is struggling with this disease. That happened so fast. That's why the Omicron variant replaces the Delta variant and with others to come, because it goes so fast. So many people are moving so many objects and people themselves from one part of the world to the other in a matter of hours with our airplanes, etc. So the world knows, you know it, I know it, that it is a global problem the minute it shows up anywhere, which means that if we're going to deal with a global problem like COVID-19, we need a global response. But that's exactly what we don't have. There is no global response. We have two ways in which a global response, and by global I mean look at all your resources in a logical way. Your medical system, your routes of moving goods and people, all the things that matter, and saying how we're going to use all of our resources to protect ourselves to the maximum from this dangerous disease. How are we going to do that and coordinate all the resources we together have? Nobody is doing that. Each country basically does it for itself. China uses its way, the United States uses its way, Brazil does its, Iceland does it. And so the first problem is we have a global disease and 185, or whatever the number is these days, of nations divided up, each of them doing it in ways that not only aren't coordinated, but often conflict. They compete for resources. They waste resources on doing something infinitely less valuable than this crisis we have to deal with. But we have a second, even bigger problem. Not only do we have different nations doing different things in an uncoordinated way, but particularly in countries like the United States, United Kingdom, Western Europe, we have private capitalism, which wants to let each individual business, each individual government agency also often, do whatever it thinks it ought to do in that situation. We don't have coordination inside our societies, particularly in the West, any more than we have international coordination, even though the problem is universal for all of us. This is an irrational system. This is not a reasonable way to deal with a global medical problem by this disorganized disarray. So let me give you some examples in case you're not clear with me on this. A meat processing company somewhere in the Midwest insists that its workers come to work and they stand next to each other on an assembly line processing the meat under bad conditions of temperature and airflow, and they get the disease, and the disease spreads like wildfire. Well, they shouldn't have done that in the first place. That was a kind of operation that should not have continued. Either you redesign meat processing, or you stop it and you substitute other kinds of food, because you have That would be the rational way. But they didn't. They wanted to make profit. We allowed them. So they kept the workers there, and the workers got sick. And when the workers got sick, they couldn't come to work. They were physically incapable. And so suddenly, what? Oh, suddenly there isn't enough processed meat. Whoa, and now let's follow the logic. The company that made the meat lost its laborers. So here's what they did. They made a decision. Some of them hired other people, if they could find them, to replace those who were sick. But it became harder and harder to do because the ones coming in to replace the sick, they got sick. And the word spread in Iowa or wherever we're talking about not to go to work there. So by the policies of that company, they were effectively, here we go, locking down that production of meat. It wasn't the government that came in and did it, but they locked it down nonetheless. They closed the plant. They couldn't get enough workers. They've been telling us that for months. Well, now let's follow the ball. You closed it. What does that mean? It means that people who used to buy the processed meat made by these companies are now going and buying something else that no one expected them to buy. They're going into the store and getting something else. And now two interesting things happen at the same time. The meat processing company is horrified. They're losing business. They're losing their profits. That's what they're in business for. What are they going to do? There are no more workers to come and replace those that have gotten sick on the line. And they've gotten a bad rep in the town. They've got a lot less meat to sell. And how are they going to make a profit if they've got a lot less? Here's the answer they learned in business school. Jack up the price. Get more. Tell everybody there's a shortage. I'm sorry. I know we were supposed to deliver to you 40 tons of hamburger or hot dog or whatever it is they made, but we only have half that. And we're going to have to give it to somebody else who's willing to pay us more. Unless, of course, you... so the restaurant has to pay more to get the same number of hot dogs, and it will in turn jack up the price that you and I pay when we go in to buy that hot dog. In other words, because of the company doing it in the way it did, managing it, and then raising its price, we're beginning to see a inflation in the United States. Because you know what? The restaurant that has to pay more for the hot dogs is going to try, for the same logic, to make that money back, if they can, by jacking up the price of the meal you and I pay. The inflation comes. Why? Because we're locked down. Company after company in the United States locks down, closes its activities, or reduces them, and that changes the economy. It causes strains and shifts every which way. And in the middle of that, businessmen who are shocked by the disruption, they can't find workers, they can't open their plant, they can't find the customers, they respond by what they're free to do in our system, raise the price. And so we have an inflation punishing our people after 2 years of COVID and 2 years of economic crash. So the irony is lockdowns happen everywhere, but they happen in a government-run, focused, coordinated way in some parts of the world, like New Zealand or China. And they've been much more successful. We have lockdowns, but we allow the freedom of each business to lock down whether it wants to, when it wants to, how it wants to, how far it wants to, and to add to the whole mess, rising prices to recoup what the disrupted system does to them. This is capitalism, but it's also the chaos of an unplanned economic system that the capitalists hold on to. And you know how they do this. They do this often in a very sophisticated kind of ideological way, which is called libertarianism. I want my liberty, you see. I want to be in charge of my business. I'll decide when the workers are sick, when there's a risk of sickness, when I respond and how I do to the risk of a sickness, whether I jack up my prices, when I want to, if I can get away. All of these decisions I am at liberty to make for my own business even though the impact on the economy is obvious and touches thousands, millions of people. The logic here is a little bit as follows. I want to be free. I want to be at liberty. I want to drive my car through that intersection over there, how and when and where I want, with my horn blaring, with my lights going on and off, and I am not going to be mandated to by the government telling me that when the light is red, you stop. And if you don't, we will arrest you. That's a mandate. That light changing, that's a mandate. Now you can go, now you can't. I want liberty. I want to be free. It'll all go better. We will all get through the intersection better, you see, if we're free to do it each in our own way. No, sir. That's how we kill each other. For me to be free to go through the intersection, I must know that if the light is green, I'm not going to be hit by somebody else because the lights coming the other way are red, and vice versa. We help each other by limiting each of our freedom in a way that lets us all have something we can't get any other way. Americans understand this. They really do. They know that we've had mandates every year of our lives. When I was born, there was a mandate. Every new baby got a smallpox shot, so we didn't get sick. Nobody questioned it, or very few did. Nobody, certainly in my family, ever did. It's mandated that I pay taxes. If I buy a pack of cigarettes or a can of beer, I am mandated to pay the government money as part of this. And I could go on. You all know it. I have to have a license to drive a car. I have to have a license to go fishing. It's all mandated, all of this. And we all do it because we kind of understand the logic. You don't want people driving a car that could risk my life without knowing that they've had to go to a test. Someone has had to see that they know how to operate the vehicle. I want to be limited because if everybody else is, we're all better off. This idea doesn't require rocket science, and it applies to global threats to our health too. And this is not an argument about pro or con the mandate. I don't want to get lost in that argument. That's a right-wing political ploy. It's an attempt by the anti-vaxxers to get you to be with them, not by opposing the vaccine. They can't do that. The science is clear, and all of us know that. That's why we don't object to the vaccines against smallpox, polio, and all the other things we take for granted. So they had to find a way to get their anti-vax notion going. It's a tiny part of our population, but they hit upon something. We don't want to be told what to do. That's nice. I understand that. I don't like the government telling me what to do either when it isn't logically necessary, which I've often the case. But this isn't one of those cases. Just like I'm not opposed to red and green lights at the intersection, which I would remind you, most of the anti-vaxxers have never questioned in their lives. They don't care about mandates. This is a political effort. So I'm not going to be switched over. I can see opposing some mandates and not others. There's nothing sacrosanct or sacred about a mandate. And our government has given us lots of reasons to be skeptical about the mandates they put. So we have to ask, are they reasonable? Are they not? Right now, for example, in this country, the Omicron variant is really hurting children. Pediatric wards in hospitals are exploding. Why? Because this disease is particularly focused on children in many ways, and children are typically not yet vaccinated because we're not yet sure that that's safe to do with children. So it's a very bad situation. Okay, but if the hospitals are filling up and you dare not take your child who has some other disease to a hospital because it's full of COVID cases, you're now not handling your COVID in a way that helps everybody. If the government can figure out how to make some people do something they otherwise wouldn't have done, and there's an acceptable rationale that it helps other people, then you have the right to say, I'm for a mandate. If you can't show that, you don't have that right. But that's not the issue. That's for libertarians to do what they normally do. Focus on the government doing this or that, right or wrong, because they don't want you to ask the question, what about the economic system that makes the government behave the way it does? That it's capitalism is the puppeteer. The government is the puppet. Don't confuse what the government does the way you might confuse that the puppet is speaking. It isn't. It's what's behind the puppet, what controls the strings. And in case you're wondering, the strings are the money. Let me now turn to the last part of the story. I want to link for you the disease, the lockouts, the supply chains, the inflation, so you understand how these things come together to produce the global catastrophe we are living through. I'm going to go back and pick up the disease is rampant all over the world. Lockdowns occur. What kind of lockdowns? Well, we'll start with the ones in China, because they're very important. There, the government is in charge. Absolute. Communist Party and the state of the People's Republic of China mobilizes resources, public and private. They tell the private capitalists in their country, and there's lots of them, what they can and cannot do. They tell the public capitalists when the government itself hires workers and runs like a state capitalist would. They make sure they all have a plan, lock down the city of Wuhan, the city of Shanghai, if it has to come to that, and so on. They test millions of people in short amounts of time. They have that all organized. Now, why is that important? I'm going to give you just quickly 2 examples. You may not know this, but the growth of China has made it so important that it now accounts for 7 out of the 10 busiest ports for sea freight across the oceans in the world. If China locks down a port area, suddenly one of the great shipping centers of the world, China has 7 out of the 10 biggest, shuts down. Ships can't come in and out. Goods can't move in or out. A lot of them, maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks, however long it takes to shut down that disease there. What that means is all kinds of goods and services are not coming, say, to the United States. They're not in the store. They're not on the shelf. But that's not some mystery, and that's not some evil behavior of the Chinese. You know why they have 7 of 10 ports? Because American capitalists, alongside their Japanese, French, German, Italian counterparts, have invested huge amounts of money inside China to produce goods there at a lower cost and ship them back to Europe and North America because it's more profitable for them to do that. That's why they closed the factories here and moved them there. And if you move there, if the whole logic is to produce over there, and the same applies to India or Brazil or any place else, you then need to expand the world of shipping to bring all that stuff over the ocean to where you can sell it profitably. That was not a decision made by the United States government. That was not a decision made by you and me. That was the decision made by 1% of the people who are employers, because it was more profitable to shut the factory in Cincinnati and open it in Shanghai. And that's what they did, and that's why they did it. And that's why we are dependent on those ports, which is why if the Chinese lock down a port to defeat COVID, which I've showed you the statistics they've done a great job at, it's going to cause supply chain problems. But now let's again follow the bouncing ball of analysis. The company that can't get half of what it's produced in China here into the United States to sell it, as it had hoped, as it was able to do in earlier years, they have to go to their American customers and say, we're terribly sorry, but the Chinese have shut the port, and therefore we can't get but half between now and, say, Christmas time, when all of this stuff gets sold, if it's a toy, for example. But of course, that's not where it stops. because that American company making the toys in China and can't bring but half of them back here, say to all the stores carrying their toys, we have only half the inventory to sell you this season. So how much are you willing to pay? We're not giving it to you for the price last year because we only have half. We will have to make more money. So we're raising the price. And we understand some of you will not be able to afford it. But we don't have but half of what we produced anyway to sell to you. So here's the deal. The price goes up. And a whole lot of people can't afford the toy. That's how this has worked out. And here in the United States, because we've been pumping the economy full of money for the last 20 years, there's lots of money around to be able to pay these higher prices. It's not that the extra money caused the inflation. That's nonsense. We've had extra money pumped in for the last 20 years. We didn't have an inflation. No. You need the combination of the more money and the peculiar way capitalism develops that puts us in this dilemma. But you should begin to see that the notion of letting every company lock down means that the same thing I've just described for China done by the government happens here in the United States when a particular company is in that problem. For example, one of the things that couldn't be brought in the United States were computer chips. Those were necessary to go into every new car. Suddenly the new cars couldn't be produced because you didn't have the chips. So new cars became more expensive. New cars purchased by rental companies became more expensive. So they turned around and jacked up the price of the rental. If you can get away with that, that's very nice. But then all kinds of people can't get a rental car, or they can't get it for 5 days. They can only get it for 2. All of these adjustments, the inflation, the disruption, these are because we don't have in capitalism, particularly in private capitalism a la US, UK, and so on, any coordinating, organizing mechanism that works effectively, which is why the numbers for China about COVID are so much better than those numbers here in the United States. And don't be misled by the media. The stories I have read about the disorientation of people in Xi'an province in China, because they have a big lockdown there, and there are people not getting enough to eat, and there's tension about it. Absolutely. You test everybody in 48 hours, which was their goal, and you move all these goods and food into the city to allow lockdown without people going out of their home. You're going to have a lot of mess ups. That's the nature of this kind of urgent action. But the results I read to you teach you this is the way to go. We don't have that capacity. And that's not the fault of Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump or Mr. Obama. That is a system that prioritizes letting everybody do whatever they want in the world of business when it comes to a national disaster. And that's not a very effective way to go. So what's my conclusion from all of this? And it's a conclusion I would urge you to take as seriously as I know how. We have a systemic problem. Here in the United States, that professor from Canada, Homer Dixon, has a point. It's falling apart. Each of these stories I told you about the inflation or the lockdowns or the supply chain disruptions, all of them are signs of a system that cannot cope with the kinds of problems we as a species have. We're going to be vulnerable to viruses in the years ahead. Are we going to live like this indefinitely? Are we going to listen to people who tell us that's what we must do? We must learn to live with the disease. That's awful. That's like telling poor people you must learn to live with your poverty. No, that's not the only option. That's an admission of failure. When you have performed this badly, as we have as a nation, there ought to be the deepest kind of self-criticism. What went wrong? How is it possible for a country 4 times larger than us, China, to have had 1% of the deaths from this disease that we've suffered. What? What could be more urgent? What is more profoundly required of any economic system, capitalist or any other, than to take care of that public health? If you don't guarantee people that they're going to be healthy and alive, you're proving that you're not an adequate economic system. We've already had little proofs over the years. The spectacle of a few people becoming billionaires while masses of people can't earn enough to have a decent living, that's a sign that it isn't working. The fact that we have people with many houses they visit a few weeks a year, while we have millions of people that are homeless, this is another sign it isn't working real well. Because, providing people with adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate clothing, and public health, those are the basics. Systems that can't do that are screaming to be recognized as being systems that have to be fundamentally changed because they're not working. Again, Professor Homer Dixon in Canada figures it out. He gets it. And increasingly, newspapers and television commentators and media around the world are recognizing what will become a bigger and bigger story in the months and years ahead. What in the world happened in 2020 and 2021 to make for such a display of inadequacy, incompetence, insufficiency, screaming at us from an economic system that couldn't prepare for, cannot cope with, and cannot even help people out after 2 years of the dilemma that they're in, hitting the American people with an inflation as the dessert after the horrific meals of 2020 and 2021 with COVID and the unemployment. My concluding comment to you all, besides hoping to have tied all this together, is this question of a labor shortage. Wrapped up in all of this is that theme too. And where does that come from? Well, partly it comes from what I already told you about the American population. It isn't growing. Companies are discovering that they don't have enough people to turn to. Now, part of this makes folks like me look in stunned disbelief. We've just spent years ejecting people who came here to live and work, throwing them out of the country, blaming them for all kinds of things they didn't do, and then expelling them or not letting them in, or both. So there's something horrifically ironic about suddenly hearing nothing else about labor shortage. You just threw those laborers away, number one. Number two, you've been very slow dealing with the opioid crisis. I'm being nice. You haven't dealt with it at all. That's why it shows no sign of slowing down. That's killing people who would be workers if they weren't dead from overdoses. And you've made life so difficult, so expensive, that young people are not having children, the declining birth rate. So the labor shortage isn't some peculiar question about workers. It's a question of human beings responding to conditions that make life very different, and that will impact the labor supply. But having said all of that, let me face head on the argument that workers are demanding better conditions. I believe that's correct, and I applaud the workers for doing it. It took a long time for those workers to suffer huge losses over the last 40 years at least. And now, finally, they're waking up. Yeah, maybe being out of work for weeks or months over the last 2 years shocked people. Maybe the job they came back to, which was acceptable before, isn't anymore. But let's be honest with one another. Our capitalists are people for whom profit is the bottom line. They haven't been quiet. and doing nothing for 2 years, even if their business was closed. They were always thinking about how maybe to make some profit even out of the bad conditions. So here's just a few of the things they've done, which will also help you understand labor shortage. Out of every 4 workers who you used to have working there, but couldn't have them working there because of COVID, you hire back 3. And you tell each of them, I'm going to pay you the same I did before. Maybe I'll pay you 5% more. But very quickly, the workers realized they got called back. They got paid the same or maybe a bit more. But 3 of them are now doing 4 people's work. And they don't like it. And they won't accept it. And they do something very understandable, but wrong. They quit that job, not understanding that this is a systemic problem. So the employer they go to is likely going to be thinking and doing along the same lines. So I understand their predicament, but I don't applaud what they're doing. Then there's another kind of worker who was put through the ringer over the last 2 years as well, and who comes back and who notices that they've brought back 3 for what used to be done by 4, and they want a lot more out of me, and I'm not going to give it to them, but they take a different tack. They organize a union. There's more militancy developing in American unions now than for 30 years for the same set of reasons. They're not going to quit a job and go somewhere else because the same risk exists. They're going to stay and fight to change the conditions of work. On the 30th of December, I was asked by 3,000 striking graduate student teaching and research assistants at Columbia University to speak to a rally they were having. I'm glad to say that a tentative contract has been reached at the end of the first week of January. It was a long strike for months. Wow. Columbia used every device that employers use. The fact that they're a university and supposedly committed to education and the values of civilization doesn't seem to mean much when it comes to trying to block a union. But this generation of young people, in part because of what they've had to go through the last 2 years, are not about to be toyed with. The rally was more impressive to me than I'm sure I was to them. They showed me young people very clear, very well disciplined, very well organized. Watch out. This system's dysfunction is teaching a new generation the way, the how, and the why a system change is now on the historical agenda. Final point. Many scholars believe that the Great Black Death or bubonic plague spread by lice and bacteria and rats after 900 years of European feudalism marked the beginning of the end of that system. The spectacle that serfs watched, that the church that promised them that the world was under control of their God, and the Lord, who was the God in the local area and has everything under control, they had nothing under control. They were dying like flies, just like the serfs were. The system was out of control. The system couldn't handle the public health. All of the promises, we're in charge, we're making it happen, we're the road to well-being. It's sort of like the mantra of the last 50 years of capitalism in the United States. We're the best system on earth. We're the ones that are growing. We're the progressive. You're going to do well here. All of that is gone. They're not able to do it. They are a spectacle of failure at the most basic level. And the argument is European feudalism never quite recovered. And I leave you with this thought. Capitalism has been rendered more transparent in its dysfunctionality, in its failure to handle problems that the mass of people have. It's been more exposed in the last 2 years than it ever was before. Change is coming. The big ones, big changes. The only question is whether those who want to take them in a right-wing direction, a la Trump et al., or those who want to take them in a system change direction to get a system that doesn't work like this, which of them will win the hearts and minds of people who will never again believe the promises of a capitalism because of its failure to deliver under these remarkable 2 years of conditions we're still facing?